Thank you all very much. It's great to be with you again for what's fast becoming my annual GALHA lecture. Tonight's proposition is that organized religion is the greatest global threat to human rights. Now, I'm sure that many of you may concur, but I would argue it's not entirely uncontestable. You could argue that there are other candidates for the greatest global threat to human rights. And one of them might be free market capitalism. Because human rights are not just about the right of freedom of religion of belief, the right to protest, the right to strike. Human rights are also about economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to clean water, to adequate food, to shelter, education, and healthcare. Those too are also human rights. Now, this morning, I woke up, went to the tap, and took myself a glass of water. It tasted good. It was clear. It certainly wasn't going to harm me. But this morning, and every morning, 800 million people wake up on this planet with no safe, clean drinking water. Many have to walk miles and miles and miles to get water. And it's often dirty and infected. And tonight, and every night of every year, 10,000 parents will be mourning the death of a child who died from dirty water. Now that is a blot on humanity, and it's caused by a global economic system that gives some people immense wealth and others not even the basics necessary for human survival. The 85 richest individuals in the world have a combined personal wealth as great as the poorest 50% of the world's population. Here in Britain, the 1,000 richest individuals have a combined personal wealth of 450 billion pounds. Between 1,000 individuals. Yet, hundreds of thousands of people in this country are now dependent on food banks. So you get my picture. The global economic system is not fair. It is condemning millions of people, hundreds of millions, billions of people on this planet to hunger and malnutrition, dirty drinking water, death from preventable diseases, and failure to provide the basic standards of education that every human being has a right to expect. So I think it is arguable that free market capitalism is also a contender for the title of the greatest global threat to human rights. Having said that, I want to examine the role of organized religion. I say organized religion because I want to make a distinction between religious establishments and hierarchies and ordinary people of faith. I don't think they're always the same. I think organized religion, religious leaderships around the world, are deeply complicit in human rights abuses across this planet. They are the ones arguing against equality, in favor of discrimination, particularly when it comes to the rights of women, who comprise 52% of the world's population, and LGBTI people. But there are individual people of faith who stand for human rights and whose faith has motivated them to do great things for the betterment of humanity. In my own case, I took much of my early inspiration from people like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, Dorothy Day, the editor of the Catholic Work in the United States, and Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan, who led the anti-war movement in the United States against America's involvement in Vietnam. Now, all those people did great, important things for human rights, motivated by their faith. So I would never say that people of faith are the enemy or the perpetrators of human rights abuses. It's the leaders who are mostly culpable, not necessarily the grassroots. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of the tremendous role that Archbishop Desmond Tutu played in the struggle against apartheid. And since then, in championing the cause of women's rights and the rights of LGBTI people across the world, and particularly in Africa. He, to me, is a person, a good person of faith, who has stood with the poor, the excluded, and the disadvantaged. He has made a stand for human rights, motivated by his faith. So whatever I think about religion personally, to me, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and many others are allies in the struggle for human liberation and freedom. If we look, though, across the world, both in history, going back centuries, and in the present day, we can see that time and time again, the leaderships of religion have so often been on the side of human rights abuses rather than human rights achievement. And it takes that picture, whatever the major faith is. There are some exceptions. The Unitarians, the Quakers, the Metropolitan Community Church, on the whole, they have been always in the forefront of human liberation and human rights. They have stood for the rights of women, colonial peoples, LGBTI, and so on. So I wouldn't lump them together with the leaders of, say, the Church of England or the Catholic Church, or the leaders of Orthodox Judaism, or the leaders of Islam. Those minority faiths are different. And we need to make that distinction. Now, of course, many of us have been rather struck by the new tone of Pope Francis, a very different tone from his predecessor, Pope Benedict. And I would say that his change in tone, although it is a change in tone and not in substance, no major policies have been changed in terms of Catholic policy. The Catechism hasn't been rewritten. The bans and prescriptions on X, Y, and Z have not been revoked. But I would say that his change of tone is welcome, small and modest though it is. Because in that tiny space is where so many millions of people are struggling for survival. And I think for LGBTI people and women in the Catholic Church or impacted by the Catholic Church, his change of tone is a step in the right direction. It has certainly put the traditionalist on the back foot, creating such a backlash that he's had to row back somewhat from his initial pronouncements. And I welcome that struggle within the Catholic Church to reclaim it for a more humane theology, even though I'm not a person of faith. I salute the We Are Church people across the world, the grassroots Catholic movement, which wants to reclaim the church for ordinary people, for the laity, who condemn the hierarchy, condemn its policies, and want to see fundamental change, both democratization, to make it truly a church of the people, not of the Pope, but also to reclaim it for fundamental humanitarian values. Now, of course, some people who share my atheist, humanist, and secularist view may demur. They may say, well, look, all religion is bunk. To hell with all of them. I think we have to think tactics. We need to recognize what opportunities there are and to ally with those who are making change, even though the change seems very small and may take a long time. So that's why I work with progressive people in all faiths who are struggling to challenge the sexist, homophobic, and dogmatic views of their faith leaders. I do that while I am an atheist, while I don't share their religious faith, because I recognize that to make movement, wherever that movement may be, inside the church, outside, to make movement towards greater respect for human rights in whatever institution is a positive human gain. But let's just take a look at the role of organized religion around the world. Take the Christian faith. In the United States, although officially and constitutionally there is a separation between religion and the state, on the dollar bill it says, "In God we trust." Leaders of the Christian churches in the United States have spearheaded campaigns against sex and relationship education in schools, condom provision to prevent the spread of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. They've also, of course, in recent years, led the campaign to try and stop same-sex marriage and other aspects of gay equal rights. They've also opposed the right of women to have control over their own fertility, opposed embryonic stem cell research, and so on, and so on, and so on. That is the role of the mainstream churches in the United States, against equality, for discrimination. In Nigeria, look at the Christian churches. Not only were they applauding and encouraging the anti-gay bill that was signed into law by President Jonathan Goodluck Jonathan this year, bad luck for gay Nigerians, by the way. Not only did they applaud and encourage him, but they have been on record as pouring out a succession of extreme hateful views about gay people, which has fueled social homophobia and fueled violence against LGBTI people. Likewise, some of the Christian churches, in fact most of the Christian churches, believe in witchcraft, and they seek to cast out demons from adults and children who they deem to be possessed. And this just happens, like in medieval times in this country, that anybody who's a bit non-conformist or different, or perhaps has been in a family that has suffered good luck, gets blamed on account, allegedly, that they are possessed by demons. And I would pay great tribute to the Nigerian humanist Leo Igwe, who at great personal risk and suffering has taken a stand against these phony faiths and the persecution of people as alleged witches. His own family and parents have suffered threats and violent attacks because of his courageous stand, as well as him himself. And I think it's a really good example of how humanists in Africa, not just in Nigeria, but also in Uganda and many other countries, are taking a stand against these obscurantist, oppressive views about so-called witches that has led to so many people suffering so much misery. I had the great privilege at the World Humanist Congress earlier this year, meeting Leo Igwe again, and George Thindwa from Malawi, a former political prisoner under Hastings Banda's dictatorship. He is now one of the great icons of humanism and human rights in Malawi. Many of you will recall the case of the two people accused of having a same-sex engagement ceremony in 2009-2010, slapped in jail, Tawonge and Stephen, slapped in jail without trial on these charges of having engaged in a same-sex engagement ceremony. Indeed, they had such a ceremony. And such a ceremony was not against Malawian law, but they were slapped in jail. A friend of theirs contacted me from Malawi shortly, in fact, only 2 days after they were arrested and put in police cells. They had no one to turn to. It was Christmas. All the main human rights organizations were closed down. They contacted me, and I organized for George Thindwa to go and visit those men in the police cells and later in prison. And with small amounts of money that were passed to him, he was able to bribe the guards to get them moved from a cell where they were being physically assaulted and threatened, to move them to a cell where they had washing and cooking facilities, to take in food parcels, medicine, and clothes, because all they had were T-shirts and shorts that they were arrested in. He did that at great personal risk. A fantastic example of a humanist person who understands that humanism and human rights go together, and that the persecution of LGBTI people must be resisted. Because, of course, it was Christians in Malawi who were demanding the harshest penalties for these two people. But George Thindwa took a stand. He said, these people are having their human rights abused. I am going to help them. And he did. And Stephen and Tawonge later told me that if it hadn't been for the money and support and resources and for George's visit, they may well have been murdered in prison, or if not, committed suicide. So it's a very powerful example of how sincere, committed, brave humanists are making a difference. To take another country, Russia. In Russia, the Orthodox Church was demanding the anti-gay law that was passed last year, the law against so-called non-traditional sexual relations. There is now a real relationship, a close relationship, like in Tsarist times, between the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church. Putin supports the church, and in return, the church supports Putin. So the human rights abuses in Russia have, at the very least, the de facto support, and often the explicit, direct support of the Russian Orthodox Church. You all know about the anti-gay law in Uganda, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which was eventually annulled on a legal technicality because there wasn't a quorum in Parliament when it was passed. But of course, only a few days ago, it was announced that the bill is coming back in a slightly different form. The penalties have been reduced from a maximum of life imprisonment to 7 years. Wow. But the range of offences has been massively increased and encompassed. So a lot more things will be illegal under the new bill. And again, it is Christian members of Parliament and Christian churches that are driving this impetus for legal repression in Uganda ahead. So that's a snapshot of what Christian leaders are doing around the world. What about Judaism? Well, we know that until fairly recently, Orthodox Jews were demanding and succeeding in blocking women from praying at the Wailing Wall on the grounds that it was unfit for a woman to have a presence at such a sacred space. Clear sexism, clear misogyny. And it took a fight by Jewish women to overturn that exclusion and to win their right to pray there. Who is blocking the peace process with Palestine? It's the Orthodox extremist ultra-Jews who are spearheading the settlements in the occupied territories, and as we speak now, seeking to annex even more of East Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, in a clear, deliberate, calculated bid to undermine the peace process. Their fanatical Judaism leads them to believe that they alone are God's chosen people, and that the Palestinians have no right to be on the land that perhaps their families have inhabited and farmed for generations and centuries. That is directly undermining the peace process. And they hold, through their parliamentary representation, they hold successive governments to ransom to prevent a forward movement for peace with the Palestinians, and a fair peace at that. You will also know that the Judaist extremists were behind initiatives to block LGBT pride parades and events in Israel. They tried to get them banned by law. When that didn't work, they tried to stop them physically. And one year, they even stabbed some people in the pride parade. Hinduism. Hinduism, not traditionally associated with much known homophobia, but increasingly in the ultra-nationalist Hinduist circles, rounding against LGBTI people as un-Indian, as contrary to Hindu values. You know, we have a succession of Hindu extremist nationalists who've spoken out against LGBTI rights. And, of course, we're instrumental in helping to pressure and secure the case which overturned the High Court judgment, resulting in the effective recriminalization of homosexuality. And then we have Buddhists. Buddhists, you know, the religion of peace. But look what Buddhists are doing in Sri Lanka and Burma, to name just two places. A new, resurgent, extreme Buddhist fundamentalism and fanaticism is in Burma, targeting Muslim people and subjecting them to a grotesque mob violence. The burning of their homes and shops, the killing of people in the street, shocking, outrageous violence which has been allowed to happen by the Burmese government, and which Aung San Suu Kyi, although a great human rights advocate, has been far too silent about. She has not spoken out against the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims, as she should have. And in Sri Lanka, we see similar resurgent Buddhist nationalism, which is targeting Tamil people and Muslim people and LGBTI people. The LGBTI group in Sri Lanka, Equal Ground, had to effectively go underground for several months because of the spate of threats against it by Buddhist extremists. And the key public figure had to even leave the country for her own safety. That's what Buddhism is now doing. And then, of course, we have Islam. You know, of the half a dozen or so states or regions where the death penalty still applies to homosexuality, all of them are Islamic states, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Sudan, Mauritania, and of course, parts of Pakistan and Nigeria. Brunei, as you know, which is very heavily influenced by Islam and officially embraces Islam, the regime of the Sultan has announced it will phase in the death penalty by stoning for same-sex acts within the next 2 years. Brunei, incidentally, is a member of the Commonwealth. Have you heard a squeak of protest from the Commonwealth leadership? No. Perhaps the most important, significant issue right now, of course, is the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, an extremist, fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, which probably most Muslims in the region, let alone the world, do not share. But it is crusading for a new caliphate where Sharia law will apply and where many, many people will face the risk of death by stoning and other forms of execution. Women who have sex outside of marriage, LGBTI people, Muslims who turn away from their faith, or Muslims who are not sufficiently devout in the eyes of the caliphate, they will all face the threat of death. And already there have been mass executions. The terrorization of Christians, of Muslim sects that don't conform to the hardline interpretation. And what is so heartening is that despite this, Kurdish Muslims in Kobani and the Rojava region of northern Syria are resisting clerical fascism. They, as Muslims, are taking a stand against this extremist interpretation of Islam in defense of democracy and human rights. I don't pretend for one moment that the Kurdish movement or quasi-state in Rojava is perfect. I would not pretend that. But by comparison to ISIS and to the Assad regime and to most of the other surrounding Arab states, they are angels. And for me, the struggle at Kobani is the 21st century Stalingrad. Kobani is the rock on which ISIS clerical fascism will be defeated. The Kurds are determined. They have held a siege for 2 months, vastly outnumbered in terms of personnel and weaponry, but they have held Kobani despite the massive threat they face. And what is so shameful is the failure of the international community to come to their aid. People say, well, eventually the United States did an airdrop of 24 tons once. What the Kurdish Muslims and others in Kobani need are weapons, heavy weapons, to match those of ISIS. They need food, medical supplies, water. They need communications equipment. They need the sharing of intelligence. Those are the things they need to win. And for everyone in the world who loves democracy and human rights, we should be supporting them. There should be an airdrop, not once or twice, but every day into Kobani to give them what they need. Now, of course, some people have said, well, you know, Turkey eventually allowed Peshmerga fighters to go to Kobani. But hey, it was only 150. 150. They need 15,000. And Turkey has played a very double game. I think Turkey should be suspended from NATO because of its role over Kobani and the Assad dictatorship. Turkey's leaders would rather ISIS win than the Kurds win. And for all these months and weeks, they have done everything in their power to block aid to Kobani and the rest of the Kurdish-held region of Rojava. You know, the border with Syria is open everywhere except in the Kurdish areas. So ISIS fighters and weapons come in through Turkey into northern Syria virtually at whim. But any Kurdish person who tries to get in will be stopped. And just the other day, a young Kurdish woman was among those shot by the Turkish army as she tried to cross from Turkey into Kobani to support the resistance there. You all heard about the 49 Turkish hostages that were held by ISIS and then miraculously released. We don't know the details of the deal, but we do know that we saw the footage of the railway carriages from Turkey going into Syria with tanks and heavy weapons, which was probably, I suspect, the price that Turkey paid to get those hostages back. So as I said, in my view, Turkey should be suspended from NATO for its connivance and collusion with ISIS all this time. I've digressed somewhat, but back to the main thrust. Take a look at Iran. Take a look at Iran, which is a Shia-dominated state. So Shia Islam is the dominant religion. It's the state-sponsored religion. It's the privileged religion. So Sunni Muslims, students, scholars, and mosques are persecuted, particularly in the Sistan and Baluchistan province. Likewise, Zoroastrians, Ahmadis, Baha'is, all persecuted in Iran by this Shia-dominated state. The reverse is the case in Saudi Arabia, where the Sunnis have control of the state and persecute the Shia, as well as Christians and many others. Some years ago, I was involved in a campaign to free about a dozen Catholic Filipinos who'd been arrested and jailed for holding a private prayer meeting in their own home. For holding a private Christian meeting in their own home, they were arrested and jailed. I'm sure you've all heard of the horror stories of what happens to Christians in Pakistan. Pakistan, where Islam is enshrined as the state religion. There's been a whole succession of attacks upon Christian homes, shops, and churches. You probably recall the horrific bombing of the church in Peshawar, where over 100 people were killed. It happens with impunity. You're also probably aware of the case of Asia Bibi, a Christian mother who, largely over a dispute over water, was accused of blasphemy and has been on death row, sentenced to death for allegedly insulting Islam. For years, every time she tried to appeal, the judge would not turn up. Why? Well, I don't know, but I can guess. Probably the judge wanted to overturn her conviction but knew that he would die in her place. Because a whole succession of judges, MPs, and other officials who've taken a stand against Pakistan's blasphemy law have been assassinated. Pakistan, a member of the Commonwealth. And yet again, have you heard a word of criticism from Kamala Sharma, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth? Have you heard calls for Pakistan's suspension from the Commonwealth? Have you heard any debates at Commonwealth summits over this vile abuse of human rights by the Pakistani regime? And of course, it's not just Christians. You know, Balochistan, which comprises half the landmass of Pakistan, where Muslims there tend to be more secular and democratic. They were once an independent nation. They became a British protectorate in the 1870s, but with their own leader and parliament. They were given their independence in 1947, and the following year, Pakistan invaded and annexed Balochistan, and it's been under military occupation ever since. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people have disappeared. Thousands. Hundreds, just in the last couple of years, have been murdered. People kidnapped from their homes, from the street, their workplace, and their bodies found weeks later, horribly mutilated and tortured and dumped on the side of the road. What Amnesty International has called the kill and dump policy of the Pakistani government's death squads. It isn't just the Taliban in Pakistan. It is the Pakistani state itself, in particular the military and intelligence services. In Nigeria, of course, Boko Haram. Just recently, another horrific murder at a school, or murders at a school. The latest of many. Most of them hardly registering a blimp on people's radar. I just had an email the other day from a young Nigerian guy who said that he was living in fear because he never knows when Boko Haram will strike again. And the Nigerian military is totally absent. Schools are not being protected. Churches are not being protected. Ordinary citizens have no protection. Again, why is it that, whether by intention or default, the Nigerian state is acquiescing and standing back in the face of this Islamist onslaught? In the Central African Republic, there's been a quasi-civil war. It's over a lot of different issues, but one of them is religion, between Christians and Muslims. The same with so many other places around the world. In Sudan, a lot of the conflict was about land, about national identity, but also about different interpretations of Islam, and between Muslims, Christians, and animists. So I think if we take the overall view of what is happening around the world, we can see that organized religion is playing a major role in the oppression of other human beings, in the orchestration of violence and terrorism, in the denial of equal rights. In the case of Western countries, it's merely about opposing equality for women and LGBTI people. In other countries, it is literally about murder and mayhem. So these are some of the reasons why I am an atheist and a humanist. For a starting point, my view is that if you want to understand the world and our place in it, holy text written centuries ago is not the way to go. If you want to understand the world, we do it best through evidence, through science, through testing and hypothesis. That's the way in which we gain knowledge and understanding. That's the way we can build a better world. And we can do so without reference to those dogmas of the past. You know, we have a great humanist document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not referenced from God, from the Torah, the Quran, or the Bible. It's human beings coming together from all different continents and deciding collectively that these principles are ideals, that we have reasoned in our minds with our own moral conscience that these are the basic fundamental tenets of rights and freedoms that every human being should have. What I've described about religion is also why I'm a secularist. Now, secularism is not the same as being anti-religion. Secularism is simply saying that in a society there should be a separation between religion and the state, that no faith should be privileged, that no faith should have special access to government or exemptions from laws that apply to everyone else. It's about creating a level playing field for people of all faiths and none. So it means that in a secular society, we don't have it like Iran where Shia Muslims dominate all others. We have it where all faiths are equal, none have privilege, and people of no faith are also in the same level equal space. Now, I'd like to say that that is the situation in Britain, but it's not entirely true. We know here that the Church of England is the established state religion. We know that 26 Church of England bishops sit in the House of Lords just because they're bishops. Indeed, as you know, Britain is the only country, apart from Iran, where clerics sit by automatic right in the legislature. We also know the way in which all the equality laws we have written into them special exemptions for faith organizations. So we've won a great deal of LGBTI equal rights, but all those protections are qualified if a religious organization can say that it's against their religious ethos. They have a right under our laws to discriminate in employment and in the provision of goods and services. And this doesn't just apply to places of worship, but also faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless, and so on. The right to discriminate is enshrined in law. Now, I will defend people of faith if they suffer discrimination. And many of you will know that I have, on a succession of occasions, defended Christian street preachers who've said homophobic things. Not because I agree with what they've said, I totally disagree. But in a free society, provided they're not inciting violence or causing harassment or menace, they have a right to express views that I and you may find displeasurable. Sadly, too many people of faith do not reciprocate. So, for example, the bed and breakfast couple who fought for their right to deny a gay couple accommodation in their B&B, they argued that they were defending their faith and that denying them was attack upon religious freedom. Well, no. They were seeking to discriminate. They were seeking to discriminate, although they were providing a public service, which in law is required to provide that service without discrimination. I bet that Christian couple would have been outraged if they'd gone to a bed and breakfast and been told, "We're not having you, you're Christians." And they would be right. They would be right. If the boot was on the other foot and Christians are being discriminated against, even though I do not agree with Christianity, I would defend their right to have equal treatment. That's where, really, the fundamentalists and I part company. They have a one-way view of equality and non-discrimination. I apply it to everyone. We also, of course, have other big issues. We've had a succession of universities kowtow in this country to Islamist extremists who wanted to hold meetings where men and women were segregated, where women were required to sit in a certain part of the room. And this was defended by not only individual universities, but by the umbrella body for all universities, Universities UK. Astonishing, really, given that these universities have equal opportunities policies which explicitly state that they should not discriminate against women. Many of them have also hosted hate preachers who are on record as being anti-Semitic and encouraging discrimination and even the execution of LGBTI people. Now, what is it? What is happening when places of supposed learning and enlightenment, universities, become repositories for such vile reactionary views? We are going backwards. We are going backwards from the days when universities were the places of liberal enlightened values. Now, of course, it's not all universities, but it's some. Tomorrow night I'm speaking at Reading University. And they had an altercation some time ago where they had a little display with a pineapple called Muhammad. And they were forced to take it down. They were forced to take it down. Bullied by the university authorities and by the student union. Yet, when far-right speakers tried to go to the university, they, of course, were automatically banned. Isn't it double standards? Isn't it double standards to have a different approach, a different policy for Islamist extremists and those who want to close down free speech versus far-right? In London, every year, the Global Peace and Unity Conference takes place, funded and organized by a coalition of Islamic organizations, some of whom I have no problem with, but some of which are very, very dodgy. Over the years, they've had a lineup of speakers. MPs from all the main political parties, and some Muslim speakers, again, who I have no problem with at all. But some of their speakers have been on record as opposing equal rights for gay people, and for women, and for Muslim minorities, who they disagree with. Some have even advocated violence, actual physical violence and execution of those who they disagree with. Yet, this conference was given a seal of approval by Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London. It was sponsored by the City of London Police. Can you imagine them sponsoring the equivalent, a conference of the BNP? Of course not. And let's not forget that by comparison to these extremists, these Islamist extremists, the BNP is relatively mild. I don't support the BNP or the EDL or any of those far-right organizations, but they are nowhere near as bad as the hateful, bigoted, intolerant views expressed by Islamist fundamentalists. So why do so many of our politicians and even police services give them the time of day? As you know, I'm not a gayist. I'm not obsessed with gay rights to the exclusion of all others. I don't look at the world purely and simply through the eyes of LGBTI equality. But it's worth noting that in the battle for LGBTI law reform over the last decade or so, all the major faiths have ganged up together to oppose equality. So the Christian fundamentalists, the Jewish fundamentalists, the Islamic fundamentalists have all joined forces to oppose an equal age of consent, to oppose the repeal of Section 28, to oppose civil partnerships and same-sex marriage, to oppose equal rights to non-discrimination in the workplace, and so on, and so on, and so on. They have all worked together to oppose LGBTI equality. But the silver lining is that in the middle of that hateful campaign they waged against same-sex marriage, a poll was taken among people of faith, and it found that 55% of people of faith said they supported same-sex civil marriage. So the leaders were out of touch with the grassroots. And there have been many other polls to show similar remoteness by the leaderships. In Britain, polls have shown that only 11% of Catholics agree with the Pope's stand, or the Catholic Church's stand, on homosexuality. Only 5% agree with the official Catholic doctrine on contraception. So again, we're seeing a disjunction between what the leaders say and demand and what ordinary people of faith believe. So that's a hopeful sign. As I said at the outset, we need to build alliances and coalitions with those people of faith who are moving towards a more enlightened stance. You know, I've been really heartened by the way in which liberal and reformed Jews have come out in favor successively of same-sex marriage and equal rights for gay people. And even some of the orthodox strands of Judaism are now moving in that direction. I'm not a Judaist, but I'm really encouraged by that movement. It shows that change is possible. It shows that there are determined people within some faiths who do want to progress things towards more human rights for everyone. Some of you may know that just about a month or so ago, I had a confrontation with the Archbishop of York, who I prefer to call the Archbigot of York, John Sentamu, over his opposition to gay equal rights and same-sex marriage. If you look at his voting record in the House of Lords, his voting record and attendance is pretty thin, but it's very, very strong and consistent when it comes to voting against LGBTI equality. That's the one issue that drives him. He is of Ugandan heritage. We didn't hear him say much against Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act when it was before Parliament and when it became law briefly. He was also in charge of a special report on the killing of Damilola Taylor in South London. He conducted an inquiry and produced a report, a thick report, which went into minute details about the state of the pavements, the street lighting, the character of the brickwork. But he didn't mention even once that Damilola Taylor had been homophobically bullied and assaulted just 3 days before he was murdered. Even Damilola Taylor's parents admitted that their son had been subjected to anti-gay taunts for weeks. Not a word about that in John Sentamu's report. Not an accident, I think. Or if an accident, he's a totally incompetent man who had no right or brief to do that inquiry. I would also add that at the time, the police tried to cover up the homophobic assault that poor little Damilola Taylor had suffered. His parents made it public almost from the outset because it was suspected that the people who'd assaulted him on the Friday were the ones who murdered him on the Monday. But apparently the police feared a backlash in the Afro-Caribbean community if they raised this issue, so they ordered a total lockdown. And I was contacted by a police officer on the case who was utterly appalled. He said, when you're conducting a murder investigation, you speak to the public about all incidents that happened in the preceding days and weeks that might point to a possible motive and to possible suspects. The attack on the Friday and the preceding taunts were relevant to the inquiry and may have indeed pointed to who was responsible. But the police decided that the black community couldn't cope with this issue and it was best to keep quiet about it. So no such public appeal was ever made. Anyway, back to John Sentamu. As you may know, more recently he's been responsible for approving disciplinary action against Jeremy Pemberton, an Anglican priest in Nottinghamshire, which falls within the diocese or the reach, the catchment area for York. Jeremy Pemberton has been denied the right to take up a post in the National Health Service as a chaplain. To do so, he had to get a license approved by his bishop. And the acting bishop, after consultation with the Archbishop of York, refused him the license, denying him that option. And why was this? Because he married his male partner. Jeremy Pemberton married the man he loved, and as a consequence, John Sentamu has denied him the right to be a chaplain in the NHS Sherwood Trust Hospital District. It's one thing to say that the man is wrong, that he shouldn't have got married, but to deny him the right to work is outrageous. Now, the case is the subject of an employment tribunal, and hopefully Jeremy Pemberton will win. But we have seen far too few protests against his mistreatment and the similar mistreatment of Father Andrew Kane in North London, who's been denied by his bishop. His bishop, the Bishop of Edmonton, who I understand is in a same-sex relationship, has taken this step against Father Andrew Kane, who married his lifelong male partner. The hypocrisy of the Church of England stinks. It is hypocrisy, homophobia, the denial of human rights. So even here in Britain, despite all the gains we have made, and I pay tribute to everyone, gay and straight, who've been part of this tremendous human rights campaign over the last 40 or 50 years to bring us to this place of near equality. Even though we've made this progress, still we have these obstacles. Still today in Britain, 36% of the British public believe that homosexuality is mostly or always wrong. Still, although we have same-sex marriage, it's not equal marriage. We've got two separate marriage laws. The 1949 Marriage Act, which is for straight couples only, and the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for gay couples only. Separate is not equal. All the government had to do was repeal the relevant clauses of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973 and allowed same-sex couples to marry under the 1949 Act. Because the 1949 Marriage Act does not stipulate that marriage partners have to be male and female. There is no legal impediment in that act to same-sex marriage. The ban on same-sex marriage was only introduced in this country in 1971 under the Nullity of Marriage Act, which was later transferred into the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973. The legislation was brought in to stop same-sex couples, and in particular couples where one partner was trans, from marrying. That's what it was brought in for. It only existed since 1971. So the idea of this ban has always existed. There's never been, the opportunity for same-sex couples to marry is nonsense. And the idea that we needed a whole new legislative framework, a whole separate Same-Sex Marriage Act, is also nonsense. So my final point is, we have made a lot of progress, but not thanks to organized religion, in despite of it. Thank you.